Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks so much, Martha, for putting together this event and mobilizing so many great panelists and speakers. Maybe I can give you a bit of a brief introduction about the Multilateral Development Finance Report, or in short, the MDFR. The MDFR is a biannual publication, and we usually take a bird's eye perspective on the general trends in the whole multilateral development system, and this includes the UN development system, multilateral development banks, vertical funds, and other institutions such as the IMF or the EU. So it's a very broad picture that we draw in this report. And one other interesting feature about the report is that our audience includes, of course, multilateral development organizations themselves and other stakeholders, including partner countries, but also one of our primary audiences is also members of the Development Assistance Committee, or the DAC. And so the recommendations in our report are often targeted at what DAC members and DAC donors can do to better support, equip, and steer the system. Yeah. And the report, as Martha mentioned, has different components. So we have generally 3 chapters, and then one overview chapter, which is the first chapter. And so the first bigger chapter is about the panorama of multilateral development finance. And this gives a bit of an outline of the economic and broader political context in which multilateral development finance is based. The second chapter is about inflows to the system, or what donors can contribute, are contributing to the multilateral system with their contribution. The third chapter and the last chapter that I will focus on in this presentation is about financing provided by multilateral organizations to developing countries. So with that, maybe we can have a look at the key trends. Yeah, we're already on the right slide. And you can see that we have some good news. The multilateral development system is continuing to grow in importance as a channel of official development assistance. And you can see in figure 1 that the ODA channel through the multilateral system constitutes about 41% of all ODA. And this share has grown from only 38% in 2018. So you can see that there's a growing importance of the multilateral system in general. Another very positive trend is that multilateral commitments have continued to grow, and especially in 2020, the increase has been very steep. You can see that in figure 2, for example. So commitments from multilateral organizations, they reached an all-time peak of about $230 billion. And this represented an increase of 37% from the previous year. A large part of this increase was driven by the activities of multilateral development banks. And they were often very successful in the initial response to the crisis. Thank you. To repurpose their funds and to adjust their internal procedures and operations to deal with the ad hoc needs of client countries. So in general, we see a very positive development, and we see that multilateral organizations, especially MDBs, have shown quite some resilience in the face of global crisis. But then, of course, we also have some bad news. The first one is that despite this rapid increase in multilateral outflows, we are still far behind what is needed in terms of financing for developing countries. And you can see, for example, here in this slide, that compared to the response to the global financial crisis in 2009, the increase in multilateral flows was larger in absolute terms, but still smaller in relative terms. And also the UN recently announced that they have a humanitarian funding shortfall of $28 billion in 2022. And this corresponds to a 55% funding gap. So on the next slide, please. Another worrying trend is that a large part of the increase in multilateral finance is driven by a rise in earmarked funds. And you can see that on figure 3. The proportion of earmarked funds is continuing to grow. And this can be worrying because it can imply that donors have not too much trust in the system anymore, and they want to retain control and oversight and scrutiny over the use of multilateral funds, because they may be concerned about the lack of accountability and transparency of the use of multilateral funding. The kind of negative implications this can have on multilateral organizations is that it can affect the funding structure of these organizations. So for the UN system, for example, we can see in figure 4 that high reliance on earmarked funds often corresponds to with a higher volatility in the funding structure of these organizations. And the next slide, please. Another stress factor that we identify in the report is that the system is increasingly fragmented. You can see in figure 5, for example, that the multilateral system is dominated by a handful of key players, and most of them are MDBs. But then for the rest of the system on the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that the system is increasingly fragmented and complicated. And so the number of active multilateral entities is continuing to grow, and more entities are competing against each other for very scarce funds. This kind of complexity makes it very difficult to see a clear division of labor among the different organizations. You can see in figure 6, it's maybe a bit difficult to read for you, but you can see for each thematic field how many actors, how many multilateral entities are active in this field. And you can see the red fields, they mark the sectors that are especially crowded. So for example, health, environment, energy, all those sectors are fields where there are more than 40 multilateral entities that are active. And this can add transaction costs to the system, and it can make it very difficult for developing countries to navigate the system and to see where and how to access funds when they need them. The next slide, please. And yes, so one reason for this increased fragmentation of the system is that we see that donors, they have a tendency to favor approaches where they set up new entities and add more and more layers to the system when there are new development challenges. For example, you can see in figure 7 that vertical funds have been very successful in raising more and more funding. And even recently, we can see that there's a tendency to create new funds, for example, the pandemic preparedness facility at the World Bank. What we see here is that the donors might perceive this as an option to bypass the complexity of the system, and they are trying to find new solutions that are maybe easier, maybe quicker in the short term, because they allow to bypass very difficult political negotiations and lengthy processes to adjust and entities and organizations. But what we see in figure 8 is that many of these vertical funds, they actually rely on traditional players such as the UN and MDBs to disperse their funds. So they have to use the existing system in the end. So adding new layers to the system may be not helping to solve problems that may exist in the system. And the need for multilateral reform can become even more acute in the long term. So with that, let me zoom in maybe on the topic of today, on climate finance and the role of MDBs. The next slide. Yes. You can see that there has been a rapid increase in multilateral climate finance. Between 2016 and 2020, multilateral climate finance has more than doubled, I think, from 20 billion US dollars to almost 50 billion US dollars. In 2020. And you can see in figure 10, it's again a bit difficult to read at the moment, but you can see which MDBs or which multilateral organizations provide the funding for the different global public goods and regional public goods in different sectors. And you can see that many MDBs are very active and prominent players in this field. And collectively, MDBs account for 86% of environmental regional public goods and 66% for global public goods in the environmental sector alone. But despite this very good news, maybe, on the next slide, please. Yes. What is worrying is that despite this increase in climate finance, it's still far below what is needed. So Martin mentioned earlier the number of 1.5 trillion per year in terms of climate finance needs. And you can see that 50 billion is very, very, very little compared to that estimate. And as a consequence, there is a growing expectation on MDBs to raise more and more funding, especially from capital markets. So there has been a lot of momentum going on for multilateral reforms, and there are many prominent initiatives, such as the Bridgetown agenda that Martin mentioned, and also the G20 independent review of MDBs capital adequacy frameworks. And all these initiatives, they call for MDBs to raise the financing capacity, especially by going to capital markets. And there's a good reason for this, because you can see on figure 11, for example, that MDBs have been very successful in raising more capital market funding. You can see this shows the level of IDA replenishment. And you can see that the orange part, which are donor contributions, they have remained flat over the different cycles, but that the total IDA replenishments have rapidly increased, actually. And I think, and most of the difference is largely due to IDA's ability to borrow funds from capital markets. But then we very much welcome these initiatives, and we also agree with the need to raise more capital for MDBs in particular. But what is important not to forget is that many of the financing aspects are intricately linked to the wider systemic issues that I mentioned before, for example, the lack of accountability, the lack of trust in the system, and so on. And it's important not to neglect those factors as well. And also one thing that might raise some concerns in the future is that MDBs, here you can see in figure 12, this is the financing mix in terms of the income level of the recipient countries. And you can see this is especially for climate finance alone. And you can see that the share of LDCs of least developed countries in the mix of climate finance received from MDBs is very little, and MDBs focus more on middle income countries. So going forward, if MDBs have to solely rely on capital markets to raise more and more finance, then this trend might even intensify in the future. And there's also a need to balance between concessional and non-concessional finance. For example, different instruments are used for different areas of climate action. For example, mitigation, in the area of mitigation and renewable energy, for example, it might be easier to effectively raise capital from private investors, but this is much more difficult for adaptation and also loss and damage, which requires much greater concessionality and donor effort. So we need to also rethink how to design funding options for MDBs to better cater to these different financing needs. The next slide, please. Right. So maybe to conclude, so this is a summary slide with all the key messages that we have. To make climate finance more effective in the future, it's important to address issues such as fragmentation and complexity of the system. And this also includes assistance for developing countries to access climate funds and to navigate the system. Second, there's a need to consider the long-term implications of new sources of funding. And of course, there's a need to diversify the funding structure of multilateral organizations through more earmarked contributions and also private finance. But that there's a need to also consider benefits as well as costs. The third point is that we need to use multilateral resources more strategically, and this includes rethinking the mix between concessional and non-concessional financial sources, and also the need between the needs of low-income versus middle-income countries. Thank you very much for the attention. Back to you, Martin.